Hello and welcome to the first ever podcast episode of Jerroms Miller Tax Bites, which is a shortened version of our full-length Jerroms Miller Tax Hour. I'm joined again by Daphne Hemingway, VAT Director of Jerroms Miller, and we wanted to just follow up on last week's podcast, which included Dan Neidle in relation to VAT on school fees, which if Labour come in the election in now 3 weeks' time, we may well see the introduction of VAT on private school fees. And we got an overwhelming response from our podcast last week. So we thought if we follow up this week, just clarifying some of the points and most importantly, having a bit of a Q&A session for anybody who wants to raise more questions, because an hour last time was clearly not enough to answer everybody's questions that came in. So I'm just going to hand over to Daphne to briefly run through some of the highlights, if you like, of last week's podcast, and then we'll jump into our Q&A. So anybody who wishes to post any questions via the comments section, please do so now, and we'll jump straight into them after Daphne's given you a bit of a background.
Yes, okay. So we were very surprised last week when we did the podcast to have such a huge response. And the normal format for this is that we would talk for an hour and then have up to half an hour's questions, but we had too many questions. So we're coming back again this time round. This is a very hot topic. You only have to Google it and you will see pages and pages of information from various accounting firms, lawyers, and the press generally. As we say, in 3 weeks' time, it's possible, if not largely possible, that a Labour government will win the next election. And they have made it very clear in their manifesto that they intend to charge VAT on private school fees. So a lot of the articles are, well, we can't really give any advice at the moment. There's nothing we can do till we see the law. There's nothing we can do. And I sort of disagree with that approach, because I think that there are things that can be done now in preparation. And indeed, trying to understand, financially where the school will be if this is to happen. We're doing modelling for schools at the moment, so they have a better idea of how their finances are going to come together in the next term, the next year, etc., based on the information we've got so far. So we know that if Labour come in, the legislation will come in straight away. So if we are looking at an election date in 3 weeks' time, then even if the law then takes to sort of December or January next year to be put in place, it's more than likely that that will have a retrospective effect to, say, the 5th of July. And the reason we know that is that we have seen it before. And indeed, a lot of the articles are like, when's this going to come into effect? It really depends on the generosity of the Labour government, if you like, because the way they've been approaching this, it would appear that they want it day one, in which case the first time that a payment is made after the 5th of July, that will be caught by the new rules. So a number of schools already have a prepayment of fees option for parents. That's always been the case, is that if you want to pay a term ahead or a year ahead or even more than a year ahead, that has always been something that's been available. So for those schools that have those prepayment options available, if parents were to make prepayments now, that is now as opposed to after the election, then it's pretty safe to do that and keep the VAT exemption applied to those fees. So there's a lot of discussion about prepayments. What I would say is that the clients that I'm looking at the moment, I've got schools that I'm advising currently, and when I look at their prepayment information, both online and in a contract, it's not sufficient to cover that exemption. So I'm just concerned that a lot of schools are trying to encourage parents to prepay now, which would work, but you do have to have the right engagements, if you like, between the parents and the school, in place. If there aren't sufficient VAT clauses, what you could end up having is that a parent has made a prepayment, maybe for years ahead, is banking on being able to keep that as a VAT exempt supply, i.e. the rule at the moment is that if you have private education, then it'll be exempt from VAT, whereas if the Labour government that get in, they will apply 20% VAT to the fees, and therefore you've got a hike in the fees, and a lot of schools aren't going to be able to manage that, and indeed the parents aren't going to be able to manage that. So I guess in terms of what the private schools should be doing now is certainly promoting prepayments. We can't say, with any certainty what the situation is going to be, but normal VAT rules say that if you make a prepayment prior to the change of law, then it would stick with the current VAT status. Again, in terms of looking at the parent contracts, the weaknesses I've seen is that you can't just come along and say, here's a down payment of 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pounds. That's not going to work. There is previous VAT case law that has said you can't just make some lump sum payment, because that won't be treated as a supply for VAT purposes. And I know that's sort of VAT jargon, but I guess that's where I'm coming from, is that schools have never had to be in the VAT regime previously. So a lot of them won't have the kind of specialist knowledge that VAT people have, and have dealt, with cases like these, previously. One other thing I was going to say is I'm looking at some schools, but I'm also advising a accountancy firm, a smaller accountancy firm. A lot of these schools will have smaller accountancy firms that they've dealt with all the way through. It may well be that those firms don't have access to a VAT specialist. And so I have been working with firms of accountants as well, so that they can continue that relationship with their client, with me just there as an expert. So in terms of what can be done now, we've briefly discussed prepayments, but just simply making a prepayment isn't going to secure the VAT exemption. If school contracts are not sufficiently robust, it could mean that the school is later forced to account for VAT on those prepayments. The parents will have expected those to have been exempt, and it could take years for HMRC to come along and challenge it. So if they challenge it in, say, 3 or 4 years' time, are those parents even going to be at the school? How are you going to track them down to get that extra VAT? In terms of VAT registration, there is a whole area that we can look at that's separate to the prepayments. So if you're making prepayments, or you're getting the parents to make prepayments, there are issues with that. But the good news is that a school can recover VAT on its costs. So currently and previously, schools can't recover VAT on their costs. So if you're a state school or an academy, you've already got a mechanism to recover the VAT. So although those schools don't charge VAT on their fee, well, there are no fees, but there is no, the income they get to run those schools is all exempt, but they have an ability to recover the VAT on their costs, which can be quite considerable. So if we look at a school, if a school is purely charging VAT on all its income, there is then an opportunity to recover VAT historically. Now that's not a loophole. I have seen certain articles which are talking about something that it is going to. It hasn't been considered by the manifesto, and it hasn't, to be fair. They are looking at, gaining additional revenue from the school fees, but in fact, it will be a net figure. So although the school fees will be, plus 20%, it's not necessary for the schools to actually put that 20% on current fees. If there is both a historic VAT recovery on expenditure or indeed ongoing VAT recovery on expenditure, it means that it's not necessary to pass the full 20% on to the parents.
I think last week we were talking about the research suggests about 14% is around what's likely to be the increase in school fee.
Yes, and that 14% will be, ongoing. You've got this one hit opportunity when you first VAT register to recover further historic costs. So yes, in terms of once this initial part is over, you will have the continuing applying VAT on the fees, accounting for that to HMRC, but then that is then offset against the VAT on the expenditure in that period. So yes, a net onward charge of 14% on the fees.
This is a question I've got. I know it's meant to be Q&A for the audience, but
yeah.
So it's quite in terms of what the schools decide to do. It's open to their own interpretation, isn't it? In terms of the historic cost. So if we say the net cost on average to a school, or the net cost to the parent, and the additional charge will be around 14%. It depends entirely on each specific school's circumstances, how much of the historic costs are recoverable, and then it's up to them, I suppose, how they put that across to the parent, whether they do that all in year one or whether they spread that over however many years, because effectively they get the refund, and so it could be accrued over a few years, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the schools that we're advising at the moment, we're looking at modelling, because you have got this one hit depending on the kind of costs that you've had before, and indeed then you've got the ongoing costs, and a lot of schools know what their ongoing costs are going to be. A huge chunk of it is staff, and therefore there's not going to be VAT on the staff element. But there is a big difference between schools that have got ongoing costs and those that have invested in building new premises or refurbishing premises across the school. New sports fields, art blocks, all of these things in the last 10 years. So in terms of financial modelling, you have a situation whereby if you're getting parents to prepay now, they are prepaying based on current fee levels, what are expected for this year, next year, etc. going on. Those school fees might actually reduce in that there is this, depending on the value, they may actually reduce those fees. So you've then got a crazy situation whereby the parents that prepaid and therefore helped the school are going to be worse off than those that didn't prepay and start paying fees for this year after the election date. So one school, we're looking at 1.8 million recovery in the first VAT return. So that is a huge amount of money. Yeah. So again, in terms of what can be done now is start crunching some numbers. We're doing this for a few schools because it's just, it's like going into their accounting and making some estimations, and that doesn't actually take very long to do to get a feel for it. Specifically, we're talking about 10 years for property and refurbishment costs. But again, everyone's getting very excited, thinking, right, go 10 years. But actually, you only get back 1/10 at the moment. So the way the capital goods scheme works is that if you have invested millions on refurbishments or new properties, etc., then that VAT doesn't come back straight away. You can get 1/10 of it back now, depending on at which stage that those costs were incurred. The 4-year test is about assets that you've got on hand, and you can go back 4 years for those. But you will have to do some kind of test to ensure that goods that you have bought, whether that's equipment, we've got long lists of equipment that's coming through. It's important that we have supporting evidence for those, VAT invoices, etc. Again, schools' records tend to be really good. So they will have a lot of the information, but before making a claim, you have to make sure that you've found all the correct evidence to support that claim.
Before we move on, I know you've got there's some unbundling parts to talk about. Just thought I'd put some of the questions that have come up so far on. So firstly, we've got a question from Lucy. Do you not think this could be challenged? Now that came in when we were talking about the recovery of historic costs. I'm not sure whether Lucy actually means the prepayment part. So maybe if we cover both parts,
I'm
because the
sure it will
historic
be
cost
the
is.
prepayment. No, I think it will be the prepayment part. I think that, well, I know that when I've looked at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, they produced the report that gave the Labour Party, how much money they felt that could be raised in terms of charging VAT on school fees. So, and it's very high up in their manifesto as well. It's not sort of low, it's quite a political issue, this. So I can't
imagine. It's in the press all the time, isn't it, at the moment?
Yes, but I think the thing is that, it is quite shocking, the idea of charging tax on education. So there's a whole load of political arguments on it, but I'm not getting the impression, and again, nobody's going to know, but is Keir Starmer going to say day one, okay, everybody that's paid their school fees now, it's going to be all right, we'll introduce it from next year, which is a possibility. It is, it's pretty harsh on a sector which is not a huge, commercial sector that's got the records, they haven't got the accounting systems in place. Suddenly to put on them, it's a big ask. So we are saying, in order to be protected at this stage now, prepayments made before the election, they're not 100% secure, and certainly it's really important that school contracts are in place, but it would be pretty hard for the legislation to go back before the Labour government were in power. So when we talk,
I think that's what we said last week, wasn't it? There's anti-forestalling rules that they could bring in, but it's very, very rare to backdate it. At the very earliest, you would think
it would be virtually impossible
to
go back before they were actually in power. It is Dan Neidle, who's a long-standing lawyer and has a different approach being a lawyer, is that they can go back to some random date when they first sort of put the idea forward. Well, that would be extraordinarily difficult to put into legislation. So given that we've seen these changes in VAT law and indeed tax law previously, the anti-forestalling measures only come into effect with the change of government. I think that HMRC are already really stretched. I think that if this comes in, it will be really difficult to help schools with their accounting, how they apply VAT, what they apply VAT to. I think they will challenge schools, but it depends on how those schools have put in place the right things. So, for example, one of the schools that I'm advising at the moment, it's made a change to its contract, but it's not. There's all sorts of aspects to it. It's not sufficiently secure that it would withstand a challenge by HMRC, because there have been previous cases of prepayment. So yes, I think there is a risk. So as long as the school is tight as possible, it should be fine.
Yeah, I think that kind of answers this other question. How can I check school prepayments are safe? Well, as you've said, we're almost guessing at what the legislation will be. I mean, we're fairly sure that if Labour come in, we're almost certain if Labour come in, we'll have the VAT on school fees because it's one of their main points. But more importantly, what we can't know for sure is when they put it in, and when they do put it in, because I think when we were speaking to Dan, we were talking about the possibility of a consultation before it even actually becomes legislated. All of those things take time.
I
So
think that
even if it comes in, we're not
yes,
sure exactly
but
how it comes in. That's
I
the problem.
think in terms of checking the school is safe. So we've got, apart from the schools I'm advising, we've got lots of directors that have got kids. You know, a lot of people who are asking me the questions aren't the schools, it's the parents. I've
Yeah.
got parents coming through. And the first thing I say to those parents is, they send me your school contract and then I can see. And they very hugely, I have seen a London school where it's pretty damn tight. But if there is any indication that parents are making some random prepayment, and that there are far too many options that you can change, you know, which kids getting the benefit, does it cover boarding and day, does it cover everything, or is it, if it's not specific, then it won't work. There's previous case law, previous prepayment case law that says if it's not specific, it doesn't work. So those prepayments, they're not covered in the school contracts, they can be challenged.
Yeah.
So the tighter the school contract is, the better the exempt prepayments are now.
Yeah. I'm going to come to a couple of Marika's questions. I think you've kind of covered this first one. What terms need to be included to ensure the prepayment is exempt? Well, it's quite a vast array of different things we need to cover, but
yeah, it's important. You've got to see that it's not a blank thing. It's like, let's look at your school's contract, look at those clauses in the contract. I can see, just reading through, I think that one's weak, that's not so great, should put this in, should put that in. So it is very streamlined to a school by school basis.
yeah.
And I think that's the key thing there.
Yeah. And then another one, is there a willingness for schools you've spoken to pass on the savings to the parents?
Yes, well, I think it's not so much a willingness as they are saying, okay, we've never been in the VAT arena before. We've done financial modelling because, you know, that's what we have to do year by year to set our fees. Now you're bringing in an extra 20%, but you're saying we can have some back. How do we set the fees? And we have got that rather odd situation whereby if parents are prepaying now and then the fees go down, which is quite possible, then are they overpaying by prepaying? So that's just one point. But if there is modelling in place, it will say they've got to find this extra funding. The school's got to find extra money in order to pay the tax. Therefore, they're going to have to get it from somewhere. They're going to get it from the parents. If there are large savings now, that is not continuing. So do you reduce the fees now for a term, a year, maybe into the following term? And therefore you've got a lower rate. And if you're lucky enough to have a child in the last year, then this additional VAT charge is not going to affect your kids too much. So the schools and the governors are coming together, and I'm talking to them about the various things that are going to happen. But we are doing a lot of number crunching in the background, school by school, to say, okay, this is the money you're going to get in. This is what you're going to have to pay set on current school fees. It's more than possible that parents are going to take their kids out of the schools. I do think that there are a lot of parents that are, scraping together everything to get their kid into the school. So this extra 20% or 14%, could mean that they don't end up going to the school. Yeah. So on that basis, I've got a whole series of nervous schools thinking, well, if the pupils are going to, I think they were talking about 7% likelihood of
that's a number I've
kids
seen.
with withdrawing. But those parents that might have wanted to put the kids in private school may not even start the process, because they're going to realise those fees are going to get higher, and can they still afford that later on?
Shall we jump into another couple of questions? This one, we've spoken for a bit on some of the other questions. This one came in whilst we were talking about the capital goods scheme. So, will HMRC allow input VAT recovery on pre-registration non-capital goods scheme goods on hand if
Yes,
they've
yes.
previously been used for exempt purposes?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's, obviously, if you're, by engaging with the VAT specialist, the schools will have the benefit of, VAT advisors that advise clients all the time. So these kind of rules are just the normal rules for VAT registering a business. And there are some specific rules. It's not even so any new business is able to recover VAT on historic costs. But in these kinds of situations, you've got a situation where the school was in business before. It's just not, the whole thing's changed now. It's not a VAT rate change. It's not, whether there's a certain stream of income that's suddenly going to change. The bit that we were going to look at, in terms of everything that school provides, there could well be a mix between taxable school fees. You've got charging for boarding school fees if the school does boarding. You would normally, if you bought school uniform, that would be zero rated for children. If you have a school bus, that's zero rated for transport. If you have sporting facilities that you make available to non-school members, I've got a client in that position that is already the case, that won't suddenly become subject to VAT. And things like the boarding, it's I know that the government is expecting to charge VAT on boarding, but it's a bit nonsensical, because if you're in a situation whereby you've got boarding facilities on the premises, then you charge VAT on those. But if you cross the road and put all your kids in the bed and breakfast or student accommodation or something like that, they don't have to pay the VAT. So you've got, distortion of. So I think the point that we were making before about distortion in competition, they would say, yes, but the school accommodation is only available to the pupils. So again, I've got a school that is making the accommodation already available to non-students. So I'm saying there's a much better argument there to treat the thing as exempt. And if it can be treated as exempt, then all these prepayments don't have to relate to exempt suppliers.
Yeah, got you. This one might not actually be a question for you, but for parents of owner-managed limited companies, would it be worth putting the school fees through the limited company as a benefit in kind? Which is slightly more my area, but it's been a long time since I actually advised on benefit in kind. I actually am not sure that would be treated as a benefit in kind, because unless the contract changes, the contract is still between the school and the parent. So the company isn't engaging with the school, and therefore I'm not sure that it's a benefit in kind, but rather actually it's effectively earnings anyway, because
interestingly,
it's the
I have
parent's liability.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's class 1A. I think it's just earnings.
We need Kate on the call for this.
We do need Kate for this
well,
bit.
because I have been literally asked that question this week. Not exactly this, but obviously where parents have various means of putting school fees through. I mean, clearly you can't recover VAT on school fees because it's not a business expense. But I have seen, and we have got a private client partner in the group, in a private client director, and my intention was to speak with her, because this particular question has arisen from one of the clients that we're doing the work for. So I'm going to extend what we're doing.
Lucy, if you want to email one of us, we can come back to you after this directly by email once we have confirmation. But my initial instinct is that I don't think it's going to work, because I think it's still going to be subject to taxable as earnings, so income tax and class 1, not class 1A national insurance. Just got time. Well, we're almost out of time, so just bring up the last couple of questions. Simon, some parents at my daughter's school are suggesting that it's a good idea to apply for a state school place for the new academic year, even if it's not taken up, as it may help persuade local authorities that the take-up of state school places will be overwhelming.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, there's no question in terms of the political, it's just such a crazy decision to make. Of all the things to put, raise extra revenue, it seems crazy to put it in the private school sector, given that the state school is already overwhelmed with kids. So what are they going to do if suddenly they've got all these private school kids trying to squash them in as well?
I did think I read something about the additional revenue raised would then be, or at least some of it would then be used for funding state schools. But
Indeed, but I mean, you can't see how that's going to happen very quickly.
No.
I think what Simon's saying is certainly, and in terms of, you may as well do it anyway, because if it does make a difference, then.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is that in terms of the government, if Labour get in it, so they're really high up on their agenda. I mean, I don't think they're doing it necessarily in order to raise a whole load of money. It's quite possible that with the VAT recovery, you're going to see schools still managing. If we're talking about, say, 7% of kids coming out of private school, I'm guessing they'll just meld in. But yeah, I haven't seen any state schools that have got some spare capacity. I haven't seen any state schools that have got any capacity.
No, exactly.
So it is how quickly can Labour government put in money into those schools? There are lots of grants going into schools. You can't suddenly build a whole load of new classrooms to take extra kids in. It's a mess, really.
Yeah. One final question before we close. Are the rules different if the school is a charity?
Actually, yes. I mean, a lot of private schools are charities, and one of the clients that I'm looking at is a charity, and they've got separate companies. So the situation is already going to be difficult, because which party, if not all of them, are going to have to VAT register, in which case, the compliance aspect is going to be really complex. Charities will have non-business income as well. So whereas a school that isn't a charity, they will just simply have the exempt fees and taxable fees. And when I say exempt fees, I mean various different activities. There may still be some that are going to be exempt or zero rated. If the school is a charity, then they will have non-business income as well. And we advise a lot of charities in the charitable sector, and they have very complex VAT accounting. So there isn't this simple idea that, okay, VAT on fees, that's going to mean everything is recoverable. It will depend on what those charitable activities are in the school.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for everybody's questions as they've come through. Hopefully we've cleared a few things up as far as we can based on where we're at with this legislation. Thank you, Daphne, for joining me.
No,
and if anyone's got any more questions, feel free to email either myself or Daphne, and we'll try and help. And then hopefully we'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye now.